And I say that because of what is said about this Jesus character. He says that whether you are free or bondman, you are all the children of God. He is still saying that it is okay for you to have bondmen, instead of just absolutely saying there should be no such thing as a bondman. So he is still in favor of the current culture of that day. This is something that you will not find according to the teachers of Siddhartha Gautama, who is the Buddha. In the Buddhist teachings, you don't have it where slavery is something that people should adhere to. You don't have it in the Tao. The Tao teaches by Lao Tzu, who is a far better even teacher than the Buddha. In Lao Tzu's writings, you do not have any teachings about slavery. You do not have teachings about treating women differently. As a matter of fact, there are times when Lao Tzu calls the way, God, masculine, and there are times where he calls the way feminine. So he creates a balance of masculine and feminine as far as the creator is concerned. So I would find Lao Tzu to be a better teacher than your biblical teachings.
Many people have been saying over the years that the Bible endorses slavery. This notion is largely based on Ephesians 6:5, Colossians 3:22, and 1 Peter 2:18. Ephesians 6:5 reads, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Colossians 3:22, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything and do it, not only when their eye is on you, and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. And then also we have 1 Peter 2:18, where it reads, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good," and somewhere right there, but also to those who are harsh to you. So this requires some contextual reading. Remember that context is critical when quoting individual phrases in any book, and particularly when quoting the Bible. The most critical context needed is literary context. You have to open up the Bible and read the surrounding chapters that set the context of the quoted statement. Also, understanding the statement must correlate with and complement the broad theme of the whole. What is the overall message of the entire book? Another context is historical context, which is reading the words in light of what individuals were experiencing and used to practicing in their environments, culture, and political situations during the time the statements were written in. So what this person is trying to get across to you guys is that you have to read other chapters, other books in the Bible to even understand sometimes just even one verse. You just can't take a verse in the Bible as face value. You have to understand the history of that verse, but then also understand the other verses that surround it and the other chapters and the other books that surround that one verse. Because if you just read those verses right there, plain as day, then you will actually think that the Bible is endorsing the Atlantic slave trade. But that's never the case, because in Leviticus, it says that if you kidnap somebody and you are found with that person, you are to be put to death. So that automatically trumps the Atlantic slave trade, because they took those people. And technically, by the Bible terms of the Old Testament, you were to be put to death. All of those people who participated. So let's not act like the Bible endorses slavery, Atlantic slave trade slavery. That's not the case. There were two types of slaves back then. There's a slave of war. If you were a slave of war, no, you could not be freed. You think that somebody like Samson, who was that strong, would be able to roam free if he was a soldier? No, he's going to form a rebellion group, and then they're going to try to start an uproar. So you got to take people like that who were soldiers, who were people of war. You got to conquer them. You have to break them down and make them slaves. They can't be free. But their children can be free. Their women can be free. Servants or certain men who are not men of war, they could be free and be servants. But the people who were men of war, they had to be slaves. The second other type of slave back then was those where if I owed you money and I couldn't pay it back within, euros or gold, silver, whatever type of currency they had back then, coins, then I would have to work it off. So I would live on your land and I will work and pay it off that way for a certain amount of time until, such amount of money was worked off. Those were the two types of slaves back then. By the way, in the Bible terms, if you have to pay somebody back a certain amount of money, $1, $2, I don't care what it is, you're technically a slave to that person until that debt is paid. So that's what the Bible is talking about. That was their context or historical context for their time back then. If you owe somebody money, no matter how much it was, if you owe somebody until you paid that person off, you were a slave to them. You may not word it that way today. You may say, I borrowed that person's money, or I borrowed this from that person, I just gotta owe it back to him. But somebody back then be like, nah, bro, you a slave to this person until you do that. But you see it differently because of the times we're in now versus the times that they were in. Now, when it comes to the slavery problem, a number of Christian apologists look only at the historical context and suggest that slavery was normal back then, therefore it was acceptable to them. But since we've done away with it now, those verses just don't apply to us anymore. Well, I'm speaking up to tell you now that no verse in any book of the Bible, Old Testament or New, condones captive slavery, neither expressly nor by inference. Those who argued in the 19th century that it does condone slavery were abusing the scriptures, and I'm going to show you. Ancient Judaism had a brutal history with slavery. The most important thing to remember about slavery during biblical times is that everyone who was either a Jew or appreciated that Jesus came from the Jews appreciated the fact that ancient Jewish history made it impossible to embrace captive slavery. They completely, thoroughly hated it. They despised it fiercely. Think about how many times God's people were subjected to captive slavery. They spent centuries, 430 years in fact, of hellish captivity in Egypt before God sent Moses to finally lead them out of Egypt. This event was not their only bout with being in captivity. Much of the violence in the Old Testament was that of ancient Israel defending itself against people who kept trying to seize them and bring them into captivity while taking over their land. So why would Jews, especially those who loved the story of Moses, ever want to become slave owners when they had such a nasty, bitter taste in their mouths about the despicable action of slave ownership? 2. Slavery was often voluntarily, not in captivity. Contrary to Hollywood depictions in American history, many of the people in this culture were not actually snatched up by some thugs and chained up and told to fight gladiators or chained up in ratty barns. Many, if not the majority of slaves in this culture were actually voluntarily. Now I know that you, if you're not a believer, are perhaps cussing under your breath as if I had said something unforgivably stupid and nonsensical. But intelligence requires us to look at things that might take us by surprise. It says something about people being caught up in financial debt they cannot immediately pay. They didn't have a banking system with mortgages, so they would literally go to the people with the money they needed and offer themselves over to them as slaves until their debts would be paid off. They would work for a number of years, living with their masters, doing whatever their masters asked them to do until their debts would be absolved. Today, in our civilized society, we call it employment. We are more civilized about employment than they were back then. Even so, how many of us have credit cards and mortgages and cars that we have to pay off? How many of us can live self-sustaining lives without either being employed by a business or owning one, or both? Who today can buy a house with a garden and live off the house and the garden without owning anyone, ever? In this sense, most of us are slaves. That's why we have to understand the Bible from a historical context and from their point of view, and not just from our point of view and our mindset, because we'll never understand the Bible at that point. Like I said, 32nd degree Freemason caught lying.